And now we have to talk about the second big myth which has to be bust, which is the over-focus of the Americans in the so-called Europe First policy. This Europe First policy, this Europe First strategy, it's been overhyped. There's been many reasons why it's kind of been overhyped. If you think about like World War II, we all kind of know the war in Europe, when we think about, the Holocaust, we think about like kind of like how bad the Nazis were. Hollywood has really kind of like added to this. So not even talking from a British perspective here, just talking about the American perspective, considering that America joined the war because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The war in the Pacific is relatively a forgotten war in the grand scheme of things. So it's a combination of a shift of hindsight perspective, and second of all, during the war, the public opinion was very much on the side of a Japanese first policy, a Pacific first policy. Now, the United States, even before joining the war, was prepared for it. Certain like generals and of course FDR was very much planning for this kind of like two theatre conflict, where you have troops be able to fight in the Pacific and in Europe, simultaneously. They obviously understood that people on both sides of the ocean needed to be dealt with. And so as early as 1940, the US Navy already had like clear plans of how they were going to conduct this war. In 1941 to 1942, within that winter there, so shortly after Pearl Harbor, there was a meeting known as the Arcadia Conference, in which the British and the Americans met, and there they tried to devise where should the focus be. Should the focus be more on fighting the Japanese, or should the focus be more on fighting Hitler? At this moment in time, a lot of people in the American camp were still very much bitter about Pearl Harbor and were very much on, we need to crush like the Japanese. This is kind of the beginning of this myth of this kind of like 90 to 10 like kind of like ratio. Fleet Admiral Ernst King, he complained to FDR that actually the balance was too far off. At very least, it should be a 70% ratio to 30%, so 70% in Europe and 30% in the Pacific, where actually in fact it was 85% to Europe and 15% in the Pacific. How true is this really? When we drill down into the data of this, we realise that actually this is nonsense, because if we were to go by what Ernst King was saying, like no disrespect to them, probably, if your family watching whatever, like your ancestors watching, I'm not, but just think of, this is kind of where that myth kind of like originated, so we're just going to tackle the myth itself. The myth doesn't have much basis, because if we were to believe it, then the assumption would be that without Hitler declaring war, then the Japanese war would have been over, 5, maybe 6 times quicker than it was in our timeline. So instead of it taking 4 years, the Americans would have been able to beat them in much less than a year. This kind of doesn't really bear out of any kind of thing, because, and to be honest, when I first started doing this video, when I started doing research for this, I'd always been told this kind of this Europe first like strategy, this myth. And so I always kind of thought, when I first started planning for this video, I assumed that America would be able to knock Japan out very quickly. But when we drill down into the actual data, we see that this is completely off. And the reason why it's completely off is mainly to do with US public opinion. Now, US public opinion, just to get our heads around this, the US public are isolationists. There are lots of people within the German-American Bund. There was the people within the American Nazi Party, etc. There's a large American-German community there, as we discussed in other videos. German Americans are actually technically the biggest ethnicity within the United States even today, so let alone what it was back then. There was a lot of people who were instinctively kind of like, well, okay, cool. And also as well, going to war with the Italians, it was like, hey, there's obviously a lot of Italian Americans. It was also before the true extent of the true horrors of the Holocaust were really revealed to people. So while obviously you did have the Jewish community there who were anti-Hitler, a lot of people there didn't really care, and also there was quite a lot of anti-Semitism still in America in those days. Public opinion wasn't as firmly shifted towards fighting Hitler as we might imagine, and this really shows. Even in 1943, Gallup did a poll, and they found that when it was asked to American people, who do you think your chief enemy are, 53% said Japan. Only 34% said Germany. So this again gives an idea of even after all of this, people are still more likely to say Japan is the bigger enemy than Germany, as late as the winter of 1943. This is partly tied into the racism of the time. We obviously know about the Japanese American internment camps, where the Japanese population within America were basically all rounded up and sent to literal concentration camps, not death camps obviously, but by any definition they're concentration camps, they're internment camps. When people were asked which of the enemy are crueler by heart, by 82% they said that Japanese people were crueler by heart than Germans. This again ties in with this kind of racism. Yes, I know that the Japanese were very cruel to prisoners of war and they committed many atrocities, etc. So one could at the time be forgiven for it, because again the true horrors of the Holocaust hadn't been revealed. But it again gives you this kind of perspective of American public opinion was fervently anti-Japanese. Like the fact that Hitler kind of dragged them into the war, from an American perspective, they're like, huh? What? We just wanted to fight the Japanese. Like this kind of, so that's why it's been a baffling thing, especially for many Americans, because they're like, why did this dude want to declare war on us? As we said, the Americans under FDR have been doing Lend-Lease. They've been capturing German submarines and merchant shipping. Everything that the Americans had done up until the declaration of war, it was pretty clear that they weren't being a neutral country. It was pretty clear that they were doing everything short of actually declaring war on Germany. They were even blowing up and capturing German vessels. I mean, short of declaring war, what else are you really going to be doing to them? Just to really expose how much of a myth this is, again, let's focus on 1943 and what the troop levels were like, what the levels of planes, the level of ships, everything. How much were the resources skewed in one way or the other? How close were we to this kind of at very least this kind of 85-15% ratio? So what we find is that in December of 1943, in the Pacific Front, there were 1.87 million US troops. There were 7,900 planes and there were 700 ships. But in Europe, there was 1.81 million, 8,800 planes, and there were 500 ships. So actually, what we find is that the statistics on this kind of show that actually there was 51% of American troops, American service people, who were fighting in the Pacific. You had 47% of all US planes fighting in the Pacific, and you had 58% of US ships fighting in the Pacific. So to put it quite bluntly, this 85-15% ratio is a complete myth, because even as late as December 1943, when D-Day's not even that, D-Day's in 6 months time from this, yeah, right? And you can see that it's at very least 50-50. And actually for the first 6 months of the war, 3 times as many American troops were sent to the Pacific Front than were sent to the European Front. So again, this gives you a real perspective on this. So all the losses that America had in the first 6 months, all the gains, etc., that was still with America putting 3 times as many troops into that front than they were in the European front. Really kind of get this notion out of your head that the American war efforts were really focused on Europe and that the Pacific was a side campaign. For the Americans, it was the war. It was the war for a long time. Okay, so you might think, okay, maybe it gets a bit more balanced as the wars goes on. Maybe it gets more balanced by 1945. By the war's end, May 1945, hopefully it's all kind of a bit more balanced. Well, it is to some degree, because by May of 1945, you had a situation where 78% of US Army and US Air Force personnel combined were in Europe, and only 22% in the Pacific. So if you want to stop the pressures there, you're going to be disappointed, because when we add in the Navy and the Marine Corps, who are obviously very significant as well, we find that actually the balance goes 70% in the Pacific and 30% in Europe. So even by May of 1945, it's still this kind of rough parity. Yes, you've got more Army and Air Force, but in the Pacific Front, you've got more Navy and you've got more Marine Corps, right? So they're obviously they're fighting soldiers that amphibious landings, etc. So it still is this kind of balance. So even as late as 1945, this 85-15% myth it's completely unfounded. I don't think at any point in the whole war is it even close to being that. Throughout most of the war, the Americans are pretty much, like roughly speaking, about 50-50. Yes, it might be more skewed one way in one year and more skewed another way in another year, but throughout most of the war, to say that America put all of its eggs into one basket is just silly, and it doesn't really bear out in any like real detail.